Welcome back, everyone. Today we will continue our discussion of Chapter 10 on human development from your textbook, and we'll be focusing on social development. When babies are born, they're immediately interested in people. They're drawn to the voice and the sights and the smell of mom. If you show little babies who can't even speak yet stimuli that vaguely do or do not look like a face, they prefer to look at the face-like stimuli. Somebody has their microphone on. At about 8 to 9 months of age, children show such a clear preference for their caregivers that they would be upset if they were left with somebody else or handed to somebody else. They might cry. That's called stranger anxiety. And there is an attachment test or measure that we'll talk about shortly that uses how children react in a setting where they are taken, where their caregiver leaves and a stranger enters, to measure their attachment. It's called the strange situation test. Now, people show personality differences from a very, very young age. And when we look at how a small child reacts to a stranger, that might have something to do with their attachment to their caregiver, and it also might have something to do with their temperament. Personality develops over time as you learn, as you're socialized. Temperament is biological. We all have a different temperament, a personal temperament that we are born with. It's a basic emotional style. It shows really early in development, so it's not something that's taught or trained or learned. It's genetic in origin. Some babies are happy babies, and those people seem to stay happy most of their lives. Some people are neurotic today, and a long time ago, they were the fussy baby or the cranky baby. Some people are quicker to anger. Maybe they were the cranky baby. Off the bat, children seem to fall into one of three categories of temperament. There are easy babies, difficult babies. I suppose that these babies are the ones that would develop disagreeable personalities, but we haven't talked about personality yet. And then there's some that are slow to warm up. Maybe those ones end up being more introverted people. 10%, this is another category. It's not part of those original three. This is another designation. 10% of them show behavioral inhibition. Okay, they might be a little bit scared. And these babies go on to be more likely to have anxiety disorders, for instance. Attachment is very important, and it starts young. Now, there are some animals, some kinds of birds, that are biologically hardwired to bond. It's called imprinting, to imprint on basically the first thing they see. Humans aren't quite like that, but we'll use these birds as an extreme example. A baby goose, a baby duck will imprint on, attach to, follow around the first thing that it sees. In most situations, that works because that first thing they see is mama duck or mama goose. However, there's some famous experiments by Konrad Lorenz where he was the first thing that they saw, and they followed him around. And they will even imprint onto a bouncing ball. Like they would imprint onto non-living beings. Humans are more sophisticated, more flexible, more adaptable than that. So we don't imprint. But as I mentioned, when babies are born, they do show a preference for humans, and they do begin to attach emotionally to their caregivers. And at a certain age, as we mentioned, they'll even be anxious about being handed off to someone else. While humans don't imprint, we might wonder whether there are sensitive periods for attachment, where maybe if a child isn't given enough attention or affection, that might damage them in some lasting way, such that they weren't able to have healthy interpersonal relationships. That's possible. Children who are raised deprived of human contact, like Jeannie, for instance, do show severe deficits and disturbances. There's some famous research on this subject from Roman orphanages. In the 1980s and 90s, there was a dictator in Romania, Ceausescu. I hope you guys can't hear that construction noise. It's quite distracting to me. I hope it isn't coming through to you. These children were born during a time that he banned birth control, and families were flooded with children that they couldn't take care of, and many of them wound up in orphanages. I'm just seeing a note from the chat saying you can't hear the construction noise, and I am glad of that because it is really distracting. Stop doing that. I'm lecturing. Anyway, these children were packed into orphanages. There were situations where there were 15 children to one caregiver. So you can imagine that the children are not growing up with as much human contact as they need. And these children who were left in that situation did show more negative outcomes. And their outcomes were better the sooner they were adopted out into families. However, you could say there's a confound there. What if the babies that were adopted out first were the easy babies? And what if the more difficult ones were the ones that were left to be adopted later? Again, this isn't a situation where you can do that controlled experiment. Researchers wondered whether the attachment between an infant and its parents was based on food or comfort. So mommy is soft and warm and also has boobs, which have the food. And some researchers wondered, what is the key factor that creates the attachment there? Harry Harlow was able to separate these factors in some experiments that caused so much upset that I believe they led to the first research ethics board for animal research. Before this, you could do a lot more to animals in research settings. You can still do a lot more to them than to humans. So here's what Harlow did. He would take baby rhesus monkeys away from their mothers as soon as they were born and see what would happen to them, see how they would develop if they were given everything they needed. They're in a warm cage, they have a blanket, they have food, they're kept clean, they have everything they need except social contact. What happens to development? He would take monkeys out of their groups, put them in social isolation, and see what happened to them. It was like mental torture. What happens to this baby monkey that is raised without any social contact when it becomes adult? What happens when you put it in with a cage of normally socialized monkeys? Well, they don't know how to cope, and they're really upset. It is possible to get them to develop a bit if they're put into cages with younger monkeys. You wondered what would happen if a monkey raised like that were to be, were to reach reproductive age. Will it mate? Will it have offspring? When they were artificially inseminated and had their own young, would they look after them? And no, they didn't. So we learned a lot about the role of learning versus genetics on interpersonal behavior. Because you might wonder if a mother animal takes care of its young, is that because it's instinct and hardwired, or is that because they learned how to do that from their own mother? And his results suggested that it was learned. Anyway, back to this experiment. So he took the baby monkeys away and gave them a choice between a wire mother that was pretty kind of uncomfortable looking, didn't have much going in the way of a face, but it had milk. So there were milk bottles. I don't think they were in this picture, but there were milk bottles strapped to this wire mother. And then the other one was the fuzzy, soft cloth mother that was slightly warmed. And he wanted to know which one they would choose or spend more time with. And they absolutely chose the cloth mother, the one without the milk. They might even just hang on to the cloth mother and lean over to get the milk from the other one. And what this showed is that comfort is an important part of attachment. Warmth and touch are important parts of attachment. It's not all about the food. Let's go back to that stranger anxiety point. There's a time at which normally developing children show anxiety around strangers. And a researcher developed a test around this called the strange situation task. And the idea was, let's use this test to learn how well this child is attached to its parent figure. And we'll do that by creating a situation where they could become distressed by a stranger. And let's see how they react to their parent leaving, to the stranger coming in, to their parent coming back. And according to this test, there are 4 categories of response in the child. One that shows secure attachment, and then 3 that show insecure attachment. One is an avoidant kind, another one is an anxious kind, and another one is a disorganized type. Now, there are a lot of assumptions behind this test. There are so many reasons that a child might act a particular way in a particular moment. And so this test, the results of this test could easily be overgeneralized. As well, it doesn't have very good test-retest reliability. Remember when we talked about reliability and validity? A really reliable test will have the same result if you administer the test again, assuming nothing actually has changed. And the strange situation task doesn't have great test-retest reliability. So here it goes. So in the experiment, the child's there with their caregiver. and they leave the child with a stranger. And we observe how the child reacts when the caregiver is present, when they leave, and when they come back. Ideally, the securely attached child uses the parent as a secure base from which to explore. And they would show distress when the caregiver leaves, but it wouldn't be extreme distress. They would be trusting enough to be comforted by the stranger, but still show a preference for a caregiver and be happy when they return. And what this suggests, remember, jumping to conclusions, is that the caregiver is like a consistent, safe person, and the child believes they'll get their needs met from this person. Now, on to insecure avoidant. This is a more withdrawn kind of response. The insecure avoidant child doesn't seem to care when the caregiver leaves or when they return. There's a bit of a lack of attachment. They don't show too much affect when they're offered affection. They treat the stranger similarly to the caregiver. They treat somebody else similar to the parent. And what this suggests is that maybe that the caregiver is a bit distant, disengaged, and isn't somebody who regularly meets the child's emotional needs. This speaks to me a bit. I was very, very busy when I was raising my daughter, and I was away a lot. And in fact, my own mother did most of the child raising. And I don't know, this probably sounds a little bit like the way my daughter would react to me, because it's normal for her to have me leaving. In the insecure ambivalent type, the child is clingy. They're distressed when the caregiver leaves. They're wary of the stranger. They're not comforted by the return of the parent. So what's going on here? Well, one assumption, and it's a really big assumption, is that the child is anxious and angry and insecure because they've learned that they can't rely on their needs being met. Right? Like maybe sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. That said, you could criticize this. You could say that's a certain temperament, like that's a fussy child. And maybe it's possible that children with certain temperaments affect their environment and elicit or provoke certain responses from the parents. And there could be some kind of an interplay, some kind of a cycle. Then there's disordered. And in this case, the child would act in frightening or frightened ways, like maybe they're dazed or confused. They act in erratic or extreme ways. One way to interpret this is that this is an abusive relationship and the child has no strategy to have their needs met. Kind of jumping to a conclusion, maybe the kid is overtired and overstimulated and had a bad day and is not ready to perform in this experiment. Maybe the child has some undiagnosed condition, like maybe autism. If there's a lot of other things I would want to look at before making the conclusion that the child was in an abusive relationship. So this is a famous procedure. It's not without merit. There are correlations between how kids behave in this test and their later life outcomes, and there are limitations to the procedure. You're kind of reading a lot out of 20 minutes of behavior. I see a question in the chat from Grace who asked, this is more related to the last week's topic of development, but does a mother taking prescribed antidepressants affect a baby's development in utero? Would the mother have to stop taking them? The answer to that question is that drugs have been assessed for safety in pregnancy and breastfeeding, and a drug may be considered safe, or it may not be, and then they can't take it, or it may not have been tested at all, in which case they might choose not to take it. So there would be indications and contraindications around that. And in the case of some drugs, the answer might be yes. So these attachment styles draw conclusions based on a single measure of how they act in this test. And is that the only thing? Is attachment to the parent the only thing that determines how they behave in that test? The test makes that assumption, but really, you can probably think of some other things, like their temperament, like other personal factors, other things that could have happened in their day that made them be, I don't know, either really high strung or really easygoing. As I've mentioned before, it's not a highly reliable test, and so you could test the same kid not very long after and find out that it has a different attachment style. That doesn't really work with theory because you're supposed to only have one attachment style. 40% of infants would show a different style when the test is done with their father rather than their mother. Does that mean that they have an unstable attachment style, or could they have a different relationship with a different parent? All of these findings challenge the assumptions of the test. There are also different parenting styles, and one way to look at it is along 2 dimensions. And the 2 dimensions could be responsiveness, warmth. So along one dimension, there's a spectrum from being warmly responsive to being cooler to being neglectful. Right, to being cold. I'm sorry, it's really about, being cold. And then there's another dimension that's about demandingness. So some parents could be really demanding, have a lot of rules, and then some could be really low on control and not offer much structure. And this 2x2 gives us 4 different quadrants: permissive, authoritarian, authoritative, and uninvolved. The worst kind of parenting style is low on both. It's low on warmth, it's low on responsiveness, and it's low on control. And that's just like an absent, uninterested, passive parent that just pretty much isn't there. That is definitely a bad parenting style. And then there's questions about the other ones. We often act as if the authoritative parenting style is the best, but there are different contexts, and actually there's some results that support some contexts that might support more authoritarian parenting styles. Now, let's say that you still had very little control, very little strictness, but you were at least nice to your kid and gave them what they wanted. Then you'd be a permissive parent. There'd be low expectations, few rules, not very many confrontations, but you'd be indulging them and accepting them. You'd be lenient. There's things that the child might like about it, but you probably wouldn't have the best behaved kids. Maybe they'd be a little spoiled. Now, what if you had that low warmth, but you had a really strict parenting style where there are rules and there are consequences and there are expectations and there are all these things? Then you might have an authoritarian style, where it has the structured environment and the high expectations. and the punishments and all of these things. But it's low warmth. Doesn't feel very humanistic or caring. That's an authoritarian style. We often speak of authoritative as being the ideal, especially in sort of democratic countries where we don't like authoritarian styles very much. And in this kind of setting, you'd have high expectations and clear standards, but it'd be more democratic, more flexible, more reciprocal. There'd be more room for discussion. This is almost like a power thing, comparing authoritative and authoritarian. Though this model is looking at it as a matter of warmth. I'm thinking this seems to be a matter of power. So I don't know if I really agree with the way they suggest that all these outcomes are just the function of these two variables. Children do well with different environments and different parenting styles. What seems to matter is that there is an average expectable environment where their basic needs are met. Sometimes there are parents who have toxic abusive styles and that doesn't work, right? The neglectful parenting is never going to work. I imagine that really nasty authoritarian parenting with no warmth at all probably wouldn't work very well either. Some children are more difficult. Some children have certain mental health needs or conditions, and some children genuinely do better with more authoritarian styles. Authoritarian styles might work better in high conflict environments. If there's a war zone outside, maybe you don't have time for a discussion about whether you can play outside and why or why not. Maybe if your parent tells you to get in the basement, you get in the basement, stay in the basement. Context matters. But we often don't think about context very much in psychology. We will sort of declare this one way is the best way and the way everything should be. Parents and peers have different influences on us. Parents seem to affect our choice of things like morality, religion, big things like education and career. Our relationship with our parents has something to do with our attitude towards and our relationships with authority figures. Peers are also important, but they influence different things. Some of you may have parents who have accents. Maybe parents who speak another language as a first language. And let's say they raised you for the first 5 years of your life. And you hear their language and you hear their accents and their grammar on English. But do you have your parents' accent? You have your parents' grammar? No, you don't. You learn the accent of the kids that you went to school with. You got your accent from your peers. Peers have more influence on our habits. Sometimes people start smoking because their peers are smoking. Peers decide what's cool. Peers have a lot to do with the kind of communication styles we use, like whether you're using, I don't know, text messages or Instagram or whatever is popular these days. There's research that suggests that two parents are better than one. One-parent households can have more struggle, fewer resources. Ultimately, there's a way around everything. It's not the end of the world if a child doesn't have a certain parent present. There are other people in communities who can supply that kind of a role, whether it be a mother role or a father role. So it's not the end of the world if a child doesn't have two parents. there's controversy around research on single parent households because it's, as you know, it's hard to do that research in a really controlled way. And so there's always going to be controversy, especially over something that'd be quite political. You might wonder whether divorce impacts children. They used to be feared that divorce could have a very negative impact on children. What does the research suggest? Well, it suggests that if you can stand each other, you should stay together for the kids because that's better for them to have both parents there. Now, if the parents hate each other and they have a toxic relationship and they're constantly fighting, well, in that case, then it might be a good thing if the parents get divorced. That might be better for the children. Are there any questions about parenting before I move on to gender identity? No? Okay. Children are born with one of three sexes. Some people are male, XY. Some people are female, XX. And then some people are intersex. And they have something in the middle. Like maybe it's XXY. Intersex people can even have sex organs that look like something in between the male or the female. We used to use the term hermaphrodite, but we don't use that term anymore. So that's biological sex. That's one thing. Society has different expectations for people of different sexes. There are different social roles for people of different sexes. Man and woman are not biological sexes, although they are certainly highly correlated. I think that, maybe 99% of people who have an XY chromosome are on their sex chromosomes would identify as male and have behaviors and a sort of psychology and an appearance that fits with being a man. However, gender role is ultimately a socially constructed thing, and gender roles have changed over history, and they are different between cultures. Okay? Gender roles are quite different in Canada than they are in Saudi Arabia. Then people have a private sense or feeling of gender identity, of really being man or woman. I think that would have been better to say than male or female, because that sounds like biological sex. So somebody might have a female biological sex, but a more masculine psychology or aesthetic. There are folks who feel that their gender identity does not match their biological sex. This can be an issue for them, can result in gender dysphoria, a feeling of anxiety or stress, and they may want to do things like take hormones or get surgery in order to change their body so that it is in line with, so that it's a better match for their gender identity. That happens, right? There are people who are transgender. And then, I don't think it's really mentioned as much in your textbook, there are people that may not fit well into either box and don't really want to be in any particular box. And maybe those folks identify as something like non-binary or genderqueer, and they might use like they, them pronouns, for instance. So some people want to be in a different box than they would have been assigned to at birth. And some people are like, these boxes don't work for me. I will say that I see society changing. And when I was your age, there was much more concern about fitting into boxes and about passing. And now, even in my city in Halifax, I see so much more queer expression. It's so much more likely for me to see somebody that looks, I don't know, maybe has a masculine physical appearance and is wearing makeup and wearing clothes that would be expected for a woman, and they're also like not trying to pass, and maybe they have a beard, and they obviously have not gotten surgery or hormones, and now that's okay. I'm seeing an increasing tolerance for that. I've noticed that, and I'm glad of it. It makes me feel relieved and happy, because there's a lot of, I recall the stress of people trying to fit into boxes and worry about passing and that kind of thing. So there is a small but reliable percentage of the population that has different gender expression, that may be transgender, folks who are LGBTQ. That whole rainbow community would have a much higher prevalence than people who are transgender. So transgenderism is small, like less than 1% of the population, but there would be a larger percentage of folks who are queer in some way. Liam says, finally, someone in psychology using the term transgender into transsexual. I guess transsexual would be when you want to change, if you were trying to change your body. Is that where you'd use that? You can't change your genetic sex. That's not possible. You can change your gender, though. Okay. So Liam says it's an outdated term. Is being trans bad for people's psychology? There is a lot of social controversy around there. There's a lot of politics. If they are included and supported, they do just fine. You do generally speaking, much higher rates of anxiety, depression, etc. in queer communities, but is that because of some hormonal reason, or is that because of like oppression and mistreatment? You guys will remember that I missed or I was late, or I flubbed up a lecture very early on in this semester because I was at a funeral, and I actually did the lecture from the funeral home. And that lady who had passed away was very religious, and she disinherited her transgender daughter. Like, she was so upset about this. She thought it was so terrible and awful and something she couldn't condone and stand for, that, yeah, she did that. And you can imagine that was very stressful and upsetting for her daughter. So sometimes how people feel depends on how you treat them. As children get older, we get more of a sense of identity. There is an age at which children probably don't even have a self-concept. Like in utero, the fetus wouldn't have a self-concept or distinguish itself from the environment. But children start to recognize themselves as different from others. They develop theory of mind. And then in school, usually at first you'll see gender assortment, like boys play with boys and girls play with girls. And as people get older and older, they start to form these more specific groups based on tastes and values and aesthetics. And in school, you have the jocks and the nerds and the popular girls. And you experienced all of this in junior high, right? Erikson is a psychodynamic psychologist. He's an intellectual descendant of Freud. And for Sigmund Freud, personality was all about these unconscious conflicts. For Freud, it was a conflict between the societal expectations and your biological sex drive, your libido. But Freud's descendants changed things, and they were less sex focused, and they focused on different kinds of conflicts. But inherent to all of that is this very psychodynamic idea that there is a conflict between what you desire and what's out there. And this conflict comes up and troubles you, and you must resolve it, or else you will be stuck in some kind of a stage. And in this model of personality development by Erikson, it's another stage model, and each stage has its psychosocial crisis. There's a dilemma that's psychosocial because it's about the individual's desire, that's the psycho part, and then what society expects, that's the social part. And it's very, very influential, and it's in all the intro psych textbooks, and I teach it over and over again, though there's really no empirical support for it. It's an example of armchair psychology. According to Erikson, the first stage, the foundational stage, is in infancy is about establishing trust versus mistrust. Is the caregiver there? Are they meeting needs? And theoretically, if the child didn't resolve that conflict in that stage, they would go on to have trust issues for the rest of the life, for the rest of their lives. And that's what the strange situation test suggests, right? Let's say they navigate that and they learn, yes, I can trust people. The successful outcome is arguably hope. In the next stage, think of a toddler that is trying to do things by itself. I remember my daughter being a toddler and saying, all by itself. She wanted to do things on her own. So does the child learn to show some autonomy? Or let's say that mom doesn't let you do anything because you don't do it well enough. Are you filled with shame and doubt? If you seize that autonomy, Erikson would say, we will achieve the successful outcome of will. In the preschool stage, kids start to play with other kids, to take initiative. Let's play follow the leader. Do you learn to take that initiative, or do you just kind of hang back and feel bad about yourself? The successful outcome of navigating this stage is having a sense of purpose. You can do what you set your mind to, and other people will go along with it. In the school age, kids are learning to do work and meet standards. They want to show you the picture they drew, and so that you can, give them your opinion. They're looking for your approval. Do they learn that they can be industrious? Do they get the successful outcome of confidence? Or are they trapped with feelings of inferiority for the rest of their lives? Erikson would say that in your current stage of adolescence, the task is figuring out your identity, figuring out who you are. What do you value? What do you want to do with your life? Let's say you figure that out. Excuse me while I need to plug my computer in because my battery's going to die. Say you figure that out. Well, now you can be true to yourself. If you don't figure that out, how can you be true to yourself? So the successful outcome is fidelity. Now, excuse me a second. I'm back. Erikson would say that if you successfully achieve that, your next problem is finding your life partner, finding love. And if you do that, now you can focus on career and family commitments, on being generative. But let's say you didn't figure out what you want to do and you didn't find true love. Well, damn. Then you would be stagnating. The successful outcome of this phase is care, in the sense of custodianship, leaving the world a better place for other people. If you do that in the last stage, you can look back on your life and say, I did a good job, or damn, like what a waste, you really effed up and missed those milestones. And let's say that you think you did a good job. Well, now you can face death with a sense of integrity. Or you go out to that good night from a place of despair. Either way, you still die. But theoretically, the successful outcome of all this is wisdom. What do you think of that? Very famous, very influential in all the intro psych textbooks. Does it resonate with you? Liam feels very called out by these definitions of success and failure. It's kind of damning, I guess. Maybe it gives you a sense of pressure. If you don't figure that out, then you're in trouble. Erikson thought that these unresolved conflicts could be resolved later in life, but expected that if you didn't work it out when you should have, you would be hampered in your next stages until you got that help. Lillian says, I feel like our development is very dependent on social context. Maybe these aren't some kind of biologically fixed stages. It also assumes a certain kind of life path. You do this, then you do that, then you do the other thing. And I can imagine that some of them make sense as being kind of biologically fixed, like early in life, like whether you're establishing trust with a caregiver or learning to do things on your own. I could see some arguments there, but later on in life, I mean, do you have to find your life partner in young adulthood? What if you are single for your entire life? Some people are. What if what if you don't have one relationship that lasts your entire adulthood? I mean, I think it's, 40% of marriages end in divorce? What if you're still working on that later on in life? Or what if now, in your adolescence, you're looking for a dating partner? Oh no, you're not in the young adulthood stage. You shouldn't be doing that. You should be figuring. I'm in middle adulthood, and I'm not too sure about my identity, honestly. Phoenix says, I feel like it's never late to learn and adapt on the things you missed out earlier. Sure. I'm not aware of any real evidence that says you have to do these things in this particular order and not in a different order. If you look at this model, it suggests that you can only get existential in the last stage of your life. But I think there's plenty of younger people who are trying to figure out who they are that might look upon it all and say, what is the meaning of all this? So I wonder if this model is based on a certain kind of myth of a life path, an expectation that you'll do certain things in a certain order. That may not be true for many individuals. My best friend had cystic fibrosis. And so she couldn't do this, this looking back and reassessing her life when she was 80, because 50% of CF kids reach 20. 20 was a milestone. 25 was a milestone, right? 30 was a milestone. She never got to have a generative career. She was never well enough for that. So, she was a very, very wise person. So how did she achieve wisdom by the age of 25? How does that work with the model? We are at 12:20. Let's come back on Friday, next class, to finish up with moral development. I assume we'll have a very short class. I will see you then. Take care.